So, I realised this session did kind of rogue in its definition. So, the basic idea is it would be good to have annotation on cultural heritage as a content domain, and that there will be things that are peculiar to digital cultural heritage that won't be necessarily applicable to things like mathematics or science or academic papers or the writ large or
Is that specific?
Yeah.
There's a lot of mathematics and calculus.
That's true.
That's me. That's me. That's mine.
Oh, it's yours?
That's mine. Sorry. There's more chairs right there.
Oh.
So, a lot of digital cultural heritage is images. So we combined our sessions to drill down a little bit into annotating images, hopefully of cultural heritage objects. And Gerardo talked to us a little bit about annotating images from an accessibility standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit kind of the things that you saw this morning as using annotation as a way to kind of add textual alternatives to images or machine readable alternatives like MathML.
So, with a big group, how about we quickly go around and say who we are and why we're here before we discuss in more detail. So I'm Rob Sanderson, I work at Stanford University Libraries. I'm a digital humanist by training and a collaboration facilitator by job title.
I am Matthew Retka. I consult for the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, consult in user experience and software design hacking for digital platforms and their new collection. Well, we'll leave it at that.
And I'm Gerardo Capiel from Benetech.
I'm Chris Chapman from Intandra for building stuff for microhistory and genealogical research.
I'm Liam Andrew. I'm from MIT Maker Studio. I work at Annotation Studio, and we also have a new project coming up working with museums.
I'm Phil Nassang. I work at Harvard University, Harvard X. But I'm interested in my other life, which is my work with, I'm a researcher columnist, but I work with indigenous communities. And we have a project, it's a nonprofit organization, and we are capturing oral histories from the indigenous groups, elders that are actually dying, and all that information is going away. So, and we're trying to see how we can provide that information back to the indigenous community in a low-tech way, but that has information. It's valuable.
Sean Boyson, Logos Bible Software. Part of the understanding of sort of the background of the Bible is physical culture stored in museums, images, temples, and art, inscriptions around the world, and so I'm interested in all that stuff too. How we make that accessible to people.
I'm Joachim Soderberg. I'm with Samsung Research America. I have a past in image classification, so I'm interested in image annotation, automatic annotation, and image understanding, how we present those annotations. I'm also the chair of the annotation work group at the Institute.
My name is Rachel Schnecker. I'm a historian by training, and I work at MIT's Maker Studio with Liam.
I'm Barbara Tien, and I have a company called Ponga, which does image annotation, and is primarily focused in the mobile space so that you start with where the camera is. My own background is also in humanities, East Asian studies, so language and art history and anthropology.
I'm Bridget Werdy. I'm at Stanford University. Half the time I work with Rob building an index of 10,000 digitized medieval manuscripts, and the other half the time I'm in the English department studying digitized medieval manuscripts.
I'm Nettie Legassi. I work at NISO, which is a library-oriented standards organization, and I'm interested in the questions that you posed.
I'm Kate Ryan. I work for TechSmith. We're a software company that allows video and image creation and annotation over those videos and images, primarily in Snagit and Camtasia. And I'm interested in hearing the conversation.
My name is Todd Carter. I'm one of the founders and the CEO of a New York-based early-stage company called Tigosaurus. We're involved in, we built a human-assisted compute platform, and we're using it to attach semantic entity data to photos and videos from the collections of large visual asset owners like McClatchy, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Magnum Photos. It's a very long list of asset owners. And working closely with Raphael Tronci and Lyndon Nixon, the guys from the, I think your group, you said you're chair of Media Fragments?
That's a system group.
Ah, sorry.
Media Fragment and Media Annotation are...
Yeah, that's right. You're adjacent. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, Robert Kastis from the NPI for History of Science. And yeah, as I presented, we are doing lots of projects producing cultural heritage to be studied and accessed, and would like to integrate the study results and the means with all the other stuff that's out
there. Right. So, I'm going to try and keep notes as we go. But as people have heard my voice a couple of times already, if someone would like to volunteer to do the summary at the end for the report back, that would be great. Or I can push my notes to you, but yeah. Anyway, think about that. So, yeah, if we, how about we talk a little bit about the use cases for annotating cultural heritage, and then see how the discussion goes from there. If that seems like a reasonable way forward. So I'm going to pick on Phil, because you clearly have a great use case, saving cultural heritage through annotation. So Phil, do you want to just talk a little bit further about?
Right now we don't, the work that I'm doing with this organization is still we're just at the collection phase. But I feel that the cultural heritage is a combination of several media types. And I think we're talking more about, not so much about how we annotate each media type, but how we interoperate between the media types. So how we connect knowledge between them, because you have audio, and you can have video, transcription, you have objects, manuscripts and images, and how they connect each other. So I think the conversation centers around how best to build a framework that brings together all the technologies in a way that we can do some analysis and comparative analysis, because really it's about giving some meaning to information that might not be well understood, right? In a very general way. If we think about the early works of Chagnon with anthropology and doing the visualization, video analysis, and tagging that with semantic concepts from anthropology, all that kind of information I think is super important. How we connect that knowledge with semantic concepts.
So in terms of the sorts of annotations that you're thinking about then, would they be mostly tagging the objects to say, or full descriptions with long-form prose? Or?
There's transcripts. So some of the things that we're doing is capturing. So these are in indigenous language, and so there needs to be a transcription of that story if they're capturing a story, and then you have to bring the elements that how do you relate these elements out? The story could be some filled with mythical characters or animals, and how do these relate? How you can translate this information? Because one thing is to transcribe the story, but the other is to actually make a meaning. It's more like transcribing hieroglyphs. What do these mean? How do they relate to the cultural heritage of this culture? So this indigenous group, how do they relate to this information? And how does the literature? So I think it's when I think about that, there's a lot of transcription to be done, but there's also a lot of connections between different media types.
that also be a part of from crowdsourcing stuff?
I think the crowdsourcing engines are super important because a lot of these are not, not necessarily scholars. It could even be members of the community that have no education, but have a very well knowledge of that. So one thing is the technological. How do you empower people to do that at the rural community levels? But then there's challenges, I think, at every level. And so how do you crowdsource? Who's vetted to actually, who's a scholar, who's not a scholar? Who do we believe and who we don't believe? So filtering those out.
Authority.
Reputation, I think. Reputation models and open reputation, thinking about open reputation badges and things like that. How do we associate those two?
How much does the digital divide play in your particular use case?
The digital divide?
Digital divide, it's a term for...
Yeah, they don't have access.
People being even able to access the tools to be tenure experts.
Absolutely. Digital literacy, how do you access, how do you involve? I mean, it is a very challenging topic. Now, we tend to think, these indigenous communities are out in the woods and they have no contact with civilization, but they actually do. Well, I mean, a lot of people don't understand that, but they have access to mobile technology, a lot of them. Most of them have mobile devices, so dumbing down on mobile devices, or dumbing down the interfaces of mobile devices can be included. Smartphones are coming in, at a smaller pace, but definitely everybody, and they all play music in tape, cassette players, or CDs, and so there is some technology. Computers are only found in the tropics, in tropical forests, for example, in the area where I've worked. The technology doesn't survive. Humidity, so we would need some of these field robust computers.
You seem to have kind of touched on everything that would encompass this. And to summarize and reframe it a little bit for my own benefit, annotation has been happening along with pace with technology, and so to limit it to a specific technology would be damaging to maybe the goals. Those goals being one, preservation irregardless of the access, and then providing access to that preservation. Otherwise, it's sort of pointless. And then technologically, at least in the museum world, we have surrogates. I actually didn't know what that term meant, despite a lifetime of art and some museums, until I was dealing directly with the data. And that's the idea that there might be a cassette tape, a VHS tape, a phonograph drum of that same digital recording, or yet there might be another digital recording. And so I think that this gets into the idea that you touched on as well, that transcription and tagging and even semantic markup are in fact metadata. We might treat them in an annotation framework and as annotation, but they're really metadata. And so this idea of the surrogate, where else can I find the representation of this object, audio recording or otherwise? And then the annotation is really the idea of interpretation. And again, access is important to those different layers for different reasons. And I believe that is my understanding and summation of all of the things you touched on.
Yeah.
Yep, you just volunteered to do the summary.
I suggest that as technologists trying to look ahead to the kinds of tools ways we want to drive our tools, that kind of a breakdown is super helpful, because as we deal with indigenous peoples or cultural moments that we have an opportunity to capture, making sure that you're capturing all of the relevant information and having an analytical framework around making sure that you're covering all the bases. For example, it may be all very well and good that you capture the voice of that elder telling the story of whatever and some other analysis of that story. Where was she? What village? We don't know. It was never recorded. So being able to capture, some analytical framework to make sure that all of the possible variables, this is where brilliance of librarians, from my perspective, come in.
Don't you think this idea of capturing all is like this incredibly sort of stilted Gutenbergian idea of like it implies sort of a production line, and you're trying to capture all the meta information at one station. What I'm arguing for is a notion of continuous improvement, as opposed to trying to capture everything at one time as part of a production line methodology.
Something has been created.
Right. So you're trying to make
moment you couldn't get everything. You come back with new understanding.
Right, of course. But it implies different types of systems.
How do you create systems that can evolve?
What I'm getting at is that there is a mixture of expertise just in this room, where there are fields that have already built an architecture, a framework for how to, like my appreciation for librarians in particular, a framework for thinking about these things, that those of us who sit around and worry about what the software and what the hardware can do can really benefit from that integration. I think that's what's so marvelous about this kind of a conversation. So breaking it down analytically into the purpose of annotations being to provide for that continuous improvement, rather than expectation of you slap a label on it, you did it all at once, you're done, let's move on to the next one, because it just ain't true. But
it's metadata curation.
Yeah.
So it's a lot about, because somebody could have taken that video, the person forgot to record the location or whatever, but my colleague who's still alive, who's not a real anthropologist, but came along on the trip, would say, I was on that trip, that was taken there, he was taken. But to your point, what's very interesting is there. I think there's, well, maybe very abstractly, there's two domains. One is the cultural heritage of cultures that have long passed and cultures that are actually alive, and sort of trying to capture the remnants of those cultures. So I don't know. Egyptology is culture that has long passed, but if you're thinking about Yanomami culture in the jungles, is a very present thing. So I think there's a separation. One is a lot of curation of data that we try to go through historical records and archaeological records, and the other is more anthropological live records that we try to tie things together.
never mind about GPs.
What?
Never mind about GPs.
Yes.
Well, the key distinction seems to be, though, that it's when you're actually annotating. Are you annotating in the field because you're understanding it right then and there, or are you annotating at a later date, and this is something that may have been a subject that almost died, and you stumble upon the research, and it somehow is relevant, and you have new understanding of that. Now, I don't know whether that distinction is important for our discussion, but it seems to be, at least in terms of the user interface and the frameworks by which we annotate things. If not, the idea is how we preserve it.
Yeah, and this is really interesting because we start to touch on location-based annotations, which is no longer an annotation on a specific digital representation on a screen, but you actually look annotating a physical space, and that physical space can then be related to map annotations and to anything that's geo-referenced in some annotations. So the location-based, you can be annotating live culture, like taking a video and it's an annotation live, or you're actually annotating archaeological record. And then you go one step further, which is sort of the stepping stones for augmented reality, when you start to have those annotation systems that allow you now with a smartphone in the future that might be capable of geo-referencing that information and displaying that information for somebody who does not have access to other technologies. So we can start moving into not just the generation, but the actual interpretation and delivery of this information through annotation systems.
So how do you mean that you could see those annotations without a computer?
So, because as I'm saying, that a lot of, and I'm always referring to the indigenous cultures in rural locations that have access to mobile technology. But as the mobile technology evolves, it's becoming more and more access to smartphones. And a smartphone could geo-reference your location, and with that information, you can pull all the annotations that are within a radius of your location. Layers and other applications do that, but they're not interoperable. Here I'm talking about a truly interoperable system where a scholar could be in a museum taking notes and georeferencing those notes, and somebody in the field could have access to that information in the field, and maybe even do corrections.
So right there is a really interesting insight, which is that the location information is in part, you broke down earlier, Matthew, the distinction between metadata, which I'm interpreting for these purposes, is information captured at the point that the original document was documented, and annotations, which are made on a continuous basis afterwards. So location information could be caught at both and have different meanings. I mean, and may be useful together, may be useful distinct.
Yes,
you know,
absolutely.
one's in American English and one's in British English.
It's really about tying all the interoperable systems together and trying to make sure that we can cross-reference. Because if we just
and Geo is a really useful marker that doesn't, for the most part, change.
Absolutely, and cultures have, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, but cultural heritage has a very specific georeferenceable location. Not just a point, but it can be a region. But you can encompass that in a GIS, geographic information layer, that says here's a distribution of this where this culture was.
So we're talking about scenarios, right? Use cases. So in your case, the ship, the Vasa ship in Sweden, sank 1632 or something. So there's a place where it sank at the time. And so if I was a tourist, I was cruising over this place, I would see the annotation that somebody did in an institution, for example, right?
Mm-hmm. It can also be somebody transcribed an annotation from somebody who was on that ship when it sank, right, and took notes and talked about it. But then those notes were transcribed by somebody else, but there's still annotations that were...
So you need an identifier of the ship?
You need an identifier of the ship, you need an identifier. The georeference usually gives you sort of an identifier as well. Because
It's very important, though, to distinguish between what's metadata, even if it's metadata that's added after the fact, and what's annotation. And without getting into the entire discussion endlessly of what actually is annotation, I think there are some simple ideas that metadata is factual, it's observable, it's immutable. You might be able to correct it, spelling a few GPS coordinates, you know, that might be wrong or accurate.
I don't think it's immutable. I think it is immutable.
Well,
it depends on the type of annotation.
okay, so I largely metadata is not something you're interpreting, it's something that you, by definition of it, it's referential to that object, that thing. And so you might do it at the time of discovery, the time of cataloging, or you might do it much later. And so to get tied too much to phones and GPS and things like that, whether it's metadata or annotation, is again to be tied to the technology, which invariably will change on us. So how do we make, is that distinction important for the interoperability of different media formats? What's metadata and what's annotation? Because as you're pointing out, other cultures now have access to technology by which they can kind of annotate their own experience. I don't doubt that people in what we would consider unadvanced, technologically industrial societies are using cell phones, and they may be like yelping some hut. That saying this is a bad place. I like this place. This is where to go. This is
and everything I'm saying is really technology agnostic, because we could have a printed record of the Geo Reference Points, and we're on a historical journey, and we're going to that, and we can take a book and I'm looking at my chronometer and looking at my stars and geopositioning myself, and I can say, okay, this is where we are. Here's all information according to this.
So what I took out of that was the two fundamental points. One is that there are certain things about the thing that we were talking about, this cultural item. There are things about it that are immutable, whatever we call it. There are things about it that are immutable. And then there are things about it that are discovered over time. And even as the things that are discovered over time, there are things that are immutable about those too. From a tool maker perspective, it had never dawned on me, and I'm kind of curious as to whether it has in the annotation community, that geo information about the time the tag was, the annotation was made. Well, that's really interesting. Got to be thinking about that too, and that too should be super helpful. There are use cases where that's valuable. That's the kind of thing that's really helpful to me in terms of envisioning future user interfaces, future development.
Georeferencing is beautiful because the accuracy of the device that you're using to actually capture the data could be off.
I understand that, but for the purposes of development, I don't need to get it. I mean, there are certain things that I have to hold on to, rocks.
But I actually want to give you a clear use case example. I did my research in the late 80s in the forest, and at the time GPS did not exist, and we started using the first GPS. The accurate position was obfuscated. Was obfuscated by over 100 meters.
Right.
So until they released all that precise data, and I then, 5 years ago, I geo-mapped all my data points. I geo-referenced them again based on some visuals, and so I actually corrected everything.
Right. But that's the point of the value of corrections, and that's the point of the value of that kind of tagging for information.
And this is where really annotating metadata, and you actually correcting metadata through annotations.
Yeah, I would really like to blur the distinction about the metadata and the annotations a bit, because it's really like...
Blurry enough already? It's not blurry enough already? I made a joke.
Yeah, maybe we could stop using the N-word altogether. So that really, if I just say, yeah, I want to improve this or change this part of the title or whatever, or the position, or have a new position, and then there's conflicting ones or whatever, just having a way to deal with it is just not...
It just seems
to
like
separate it so far out that one thing is just something people do later, and one thing is what people, the experts, really do, and so really to have it be more fluid.
It seems like disagreement is so critical too, right? Like
yes,
capturing disagreement, so that you don't necessarily want a single canonical view of truth.
We have that. We have a project for Islamic manuscripts, and then I said we're trying to build a bibliographical database for manuscripts, which is already problematic because the normal stuff like title unknown, author unknown, place unknown, year somewhere between 900 and 1200, stuff like that. So one of the important things that also the authors wanted, the scholars working on the database said, yeah, we also want a record who is not the author. Because they said, well, for 50 years, everybody believed that this person was the author of this text. Now we know better. But we also want to record that it was believed until now, and now we know better. Because they say people come to the website and they search for it, and they say, somebody else did it. This is all wrong. These people know nothing. And we say, no, we do know.
So how important is change tracking?
Is what?
Change tracking.
Like problem, it's critical, particularly if you're trying to reason with a machine on top of the data, which is one of the great use cases
for annotations is to support like reasoners and RDF. You better know what entity produced that label or that annotation.
Well, provenance is a different question from change tracking specifically, I think.
But you also want to track the provenance.
Yes, I'm thinking in terms of, the change was made at less than such a time, less than such a date, by less than such a person.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
As opposed to where is the historical...
We're using provenance slightly differently. I'm using it in a semantic context.
So as a logistical point, it is now 3 o'clock. And if I recall correctly, Dan said that we should continue until 3:10. So
10. So, do any of these ideas that we all brought up, are they different for the types of media, the types of objects that cultural institutions would be dealing with? Not that cultural institutions or cultural heritage institutions don't deal with text or legal documents or things that are very well underway in terms of being able to annotate and record the types of things that we don't do as well. Images, audio, video, actual physical objects that we've taken video of.
3D objects.
That's what I
I
meant.
mean, the 3D objects, you can take a flat plane picture, you can take a lot of flat plane pictures. Nowadays, I suppose you can generate a 3D copy, sort of, depending on the object, size, and so on.
So where it's very different is typically you have one document or many documents that you can say are part of a book or collection. And for whatever reason, in my experience, that's more difficult or less standardized with images to say that these series of images must go together, or these series of images must go together in this particular sequence. That's challenging. That's really challenging, at least in the museum world, just saying these things are supposed to go on the wall in this order, or the portfolio is in this order. And so I don't think there's a standard in that at all, but it seems relevant if you're going to take flat pictures of a 3D object or sequential bits of audio.
But don't you have that in...
It's gone.
We have
in artistry. Well, at least I know the problem from photo collections.
Right.
For images where they have 15 photos of one statue, and then of course you have the problem, you have a photo, you have something what's pictured on the photo, and then so the different photos picture the same object, maybe at different times.
Right, and large detail in situ, a picture of it on the wall versus in storage in the crate, the back of the object, bottom of the base. There's no standard. There are best practices at major institutions. I know a little bit of them, but
I just think that some of the important technologies with cultural heritage, or from my perspective, are we need to think more about how to implement multi-targeted annotations. So systems that will allow to do that because you're connecting objects. And definition of ontologies to, we could talk about concept tagging, but I think it would be much more powerful to think about the creation of ontologies for cultural heritage. It would allow us to disambiguate any terminology discussions that we would have. It's a document that's extendable. We don't have to rely on one ontology. We can rely on multiple ontologies. So ontologies that would refer to metadata that's associated with metadata from libraries that have a very well-defined way of classifying things, but ontologies that can be domain-specific to the different regions. So then we can start doing searches and semantic searches. But that's
I think
one.
there are several such ontologies.
Yes, absolutely. And see which ones apply. I mean, identify which ontologies apply, and also identifying where are the spaces that need to be filled in terms of ontology definitions.
So up on the ontology thing. I'm not so positive, hopeful about the ontology thing. We just need another ontology.
You know why? Because
then we understand each other.
Yeah, we're not thinking too much about ontology because the concept of ontologies is not very well understood. But the industry, I mean, the computational definition of ontology is not well understood. But what is true is that the industry is starting to understand the potential of that, and they are starting to use it, and we're lagging behind on that. As digital humanists, digital socialists, social scientists, digital communists.
In San Francisco, you're safe.
Sciences are leaps and bounds ahead, but we need to think.
Ask the math people about ontologies.
Right. But they are going that way. But if you think about Amazon and all these companies that are selling products, they're relying on ontologies tremendously.
I was just going to say, I agree with you. That's one thing I like with the open annotation. It's a simple ontology. It's graspable. But there are contradictions there as well, because from Alpha, obviously, they say they need a very, very specific ontology. So there is no one answer to that.
I'm fine with ontologies on the, so to speak, data model level, like open annotation is one.
Well, media annotation was trying to bridge between 24 different metadata formats to make it easier for web developers to search content on the web. And,
didn't get adopted very well, did it?
No. web browser providers didn't implement it.
Can I ask a general question, maybe those of you in the institution side? There are interests in sharing. At some point, in building something for your own institution, you get to lay the rules. We shall do it this way. But is there a standards basis? Is there a desire across institutions? Maybe this is a lot of the work that you're doing.
At the funding level, or at the level of the NEH, there absolutely is. If you want money from the NEH, you better be talking about.
We're talking about who's paying the band here, right?
Yeah.
And that's some of where this kind of direction is going to come, or is it? For those of you among institutions.
More specifically and with more knowledge than I have for this, but Europe has done a lot more to try and standardize, and mainly because they have maybe better funding for their major cultural institutions. So the Rijksmuseum, the British Museum. So we have Dublin Core, and out of that has come various, I forget what the C is, but CDWA, like describing works of art. And so these are, in fact, ontologies. They're all subsets, usually of the Dublin Core. And Getty has some canonical sources for describing images and conservation. The canonical names for artists and all the aliases are also known as for authors who write. So those things do exist, and they are somewhat used in North America for sparkle queries between the Met and Boston Museum and who else. It's still a bit disparate fiefdoms, but people are trying, and I think one of the reasons that it is that way is for the very reason we're having this meeting. There are ideas that aren't completely resolved, and they're challenging things to consider.
I think
we've been reconsidering them every few generations. This isn't the first time we've been stuffing things in boxes and putting labels on them. We're on the work.
A lot of the vocabularies we want a grant with the University of New York to do a lot of linked data, re-annotate the collection with free-base IDs, basically. But a lot of the digital asset management systems that the Mint use to manage their collections are siloed. They're from a different generation. They don't support RDF or linked data. They're not easily widgetizable in terms of adding components to the front end to support
some
use cases.
Databases are even so closed that you can't get at the data without some proprietary driver.
That's a real challenge for humanities organizations in general, is to kind of break out of those silos.
It also begs the question, what can we do to not screw this up for the future? To put it perfectly, I mean,
be a funder.
It's trying to work with agnostic to technologies, and this is where we start talking about standards and ontologies and definitions that withstand time. And that's why, and disambiguations as well. And looking at ontologies, there's BBC. If anyone has done a research, looked at BBC ontologies, they've got some really, really basic, simple ontologies. So we always think about the complications of an ontology, but we can start very simple and build up from there. But there's got to be an agreement. I think that's the main thing.
You guys have to start the avalanche, because once you guys enter, we can start.